They say every man has a price. But what happens when that price isn't gold or power, but love? This is the story of a king who gave up everything, his throne, his power, and his legacy, for the only woman who made him feel truly alive. Our story begins in the 12th century in England, a kingdom torn between politics and passions. Henry II, a cunning and ambitious monarch, ruled with determination. But today we won't speak of him. Instead, we'll focus on his great-grandson, Edward VIII, a man whose heart led him to defy the oldest rules of royalty. Throughout history, royal marriages have been political transactions. Love and the throne rarely go hand in hand. But in 1936, Edward VIII broke with this tradition, starring in one of the greatest scandals of modern history. He fell in love with Wallis Simpson, an American woman who had been divorced not once, but twice. For the British royal family, this was unacceptable. It all began one autumn afternoon in London at one of the exclusive parties of the British high society. Edward, then the Prince of Wales, was, as always, the center of attention. Charismatic, charming, and with a smile capable of winning over anyone, he was admired by all around him. But in that crowd, there was someone who caught his attention like no one else had before. Wallis Simpson, an American woman with an elegant demeanor and a magnetic personality. Wallis was unlike the other women who usually surrounded the prince. She had a sharp wit, a vibrant intelligence, and an attitude that defied the norms of the time. She was a woman who wasn't intimidated by royalty, and that fascinated Edward. From their first meeting, the prince was captivated by her. Wallis, for her part, saw in Edward more than just a future king. She saw a vulnerable man, trapped in the rigid protocol of the crown. The relationship began discreetly. Edward invited her on private walks and small gatherings, away from public scrutiny. To him, Wallis represented everything the monarchy was not: freedom, spontaneity, and genuine connection. But it wasn't long before their closeness began to spark rumors in social circles. Wallis had a past that made her a controversial figure. She had been married twice, and in an era when divorce was considered scandalous, this made her an unacceptable choice for royalty. Edward's advisors tried to warn him of the danger this relationship posed to his reputation and his future as king. But the prince wasn't willing to listen. "Wallis understands me like no one else has," he would often say. For Edward, the connection he felt with her was something he had never experienced before. Wallis wasn't just his confidant and friend. She had become the love of his life. As time went on, it became increasingly clear that Edward wasn't willing to give her up, no matter the consequences. In public, the couple tried to maintain appearances. Wallis attended official events as just another guest, but everyone knew she was much more to the prince. The British press, bound by an unofficial agreement with the royal family, avoided covering the relationship openly. However, outside the UK, international newspapers began publishing headlines about the scandal. The relationship not only caused discomfort in social circles, but also created tensions within the royal family. His father, King George V, openly disapproved of Wallis and feared Edward wasn't prepared for the role of king. Even after George V's death and Edward's ascension to the throne, Wallis's shadow remained a constant concern at Buckingham Palace. With his coronation in 1936, Edward VIII inherited not only the responsibility of ruling an empire, but also the pressure to choose between his love for Wallis and his duty as king. The rumors intensified when Edward began speaking openly about his desire to marry her. This was the breaking point. For the Church of England, which Edward led as monarch, it was unthinkable for the king to marry a divorced woman. British politicians, fearing a scandal that could weaken the institution of the monarchy, began pressuring the king to end the relationship. But Edward, far from yielding, stood firm in his decision. If he couldn't marry Wallis, he had no interest in remaining king. Thus, the love between Edward and Wallis ceased to be a private matter and became a political crisis. It was evident that this was no ordinary love story. It was a battle between tradition and desire, between duty and the heart. And Edward was willing to sacrifice everything, even his crown for the woman he loved. Here's the translation to English. Thus, the love between Edward and Wallace ceased to be a private matter and became a political crisis. It was evident that this was not an ordinary love story. It was a battle between tradition and desire, between duty and the heart. And Edward was willing to sacrifice everything, even his crown, for the woman he loved. The tension reached its peak at the end of that same year. Edward had two options: leave Wallace and remain king, or abdicate the throne to be with the woman he loved. It was a choice between duty and the heart. In December 1936, Edward made a decision that shook the world. He abdicated. In a radio broadcast, Edward VIII spoke directly to his people. He said, I found it impossible to carry out my duties as king without the help and support of the woman I love. These words marked the end of his reign and the beginning of a completely different life. With his abdication, Edward left behind not only the crown, but also his identity as a monarch. He became the Duke of Windsor and married Wallace in a private ceremony in France. Their love story transcended borders, but also condemned them to social exile. After their marriage, Edward and Wallace spent much of their lives traveling across Europe and the United States. Although they seemed happy together, not everything was a fairy tale. Without a clear role in politics or society, Edward often felt lost. But for him, being with Wallace was always worth it. Meanwhile, the British royal family distanced themselves from them. Edward's relationship with his brother, George VI, who took the throne, remained tense for years. The press and the public also held divided opinions. Some saw them as a romantic couple defying norms, while others considered them irresponsible for prioritizing love over duty. To this day, the story of Edward VIII and Wallace Simpson continues to divide opinions. Was Edward a romantic hero or a king who abandoned his nation in a crucial moment? What no one can deny is that his sacrifice marked a turning point in the perception of modern monarchies. His decision sparked a debate about the role of royalty in the contemporary world. Should a monarch live for the people or for themselves? It's a question that still resonates today, in an era where royal traditions continue to clash with individual values. Edward VIII's love for Wallace Simpson transcended time and borders, but it also came at an immense cost. He gave up his kingdom, his identity, and his legacy for one person. Was it an act of true love or selfishness? That depends on how you see it. In the end, the story of Edward and Wallace reminds us of something important. Love has the power to challenge any norm, even the most unshakable ones. And you, how far would you go for love? Let us know your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to discover more stories like this. Because deep down, we're all searching for something worth sacrificing everything for.